What happens when a simple woman who doesn't look the part takes her seat in first class, only to be served a cold sandwich while everyone else is sipping champagne? She says nothing. She doesn't yell. She doesn't even raise her voice. But what does she do next? It forces one of the most prestigious airlines in the world to rewrite how they treat people forever. This isn't just a story about a meal. It's about silent bias, quiet power, and one woman who showed the world you don't have to look important to make real change. Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you might never look at first class or assumptions the same way again. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Alive Stories. Today's story is about a simple woman denied a first-class meal. What she did next shook the entire airline. Let's get started. Clara Jennings didn't look like she belonged in seat 2A. At least, not by first-class standards. She wasn't wearing a pantsuit, no designer heels, no sleek carry-on with gold zippers, just a worn canvas backpack, a pair of walking shoes with faded soles, and a soft knit cardigan wrapped around her shoulders like a second thought. Still, she sat upright, calm, present, grateful, until the tray arrived. "Your meal, ma'am," said the flight attendant, placing a small plastic box on the pull-out tray. Turkey sandwich and bottled water. Clara blinked. "I'm sorry, this isn't what I ordered," she said gently. "I requested the gluten-free vegetarian meal when the flight was confirmed." The attendant didn't look at her. She was already turning to serve the next passenger. "Special meals are reserved for priority tier guests," the attendant replied. Her voice clipped. "Efficient. Standard meal applies since your seat was part of a complimentary ticket." Then she was gone. Just like that. Clara looked down at the sandwich. Processed meat curling at the edges. The bread was thick and stale-looking. No note, no apology. The man in 2B, white, mid-50s, silver Rolex, leather briefcase between his shoes, was halfway through his lobster tail and sipping from a glass of white burgundy. "Caviar next," he told the same attendant with a smile. She laughed. He winked. No one looked at Clara. No one asked if she was okay. She folded her napkin slowly, placed it back on the tray, and quietly pushed it away. She didn't say anything more, but something inside her changed. The first-class cabin of Flight 48 was designed to feel like a boutique hotel in the sky. Cream leather seats, subtle mood lighting, chilled towels scented with lemon verbena. But to Clara Jennings, at that moment, it felt cold, not in temperature, in tone, in treatment, in what wasn't said but deeply felt. It wasn't about the sandwich. Not really. It was about how the flight attendant's voice shifted from neutral to dismissive, about the way her eyes avoided contact, about the subtle shrug that said, "You're lucky you're even here." It wasn't the first time Clara had been talked around rather than to. She'd felt it in hotel lobbies, department stores, and parent-teacher meetings. The way people's tones changed based on what you wore, how you spoke, or which part of the city you were from. But this time felt different, because this wasn't just public space. This was first class. This was a place people believed they had earned, and some of them believed people like Clara hadn't. She glanced again at her boarding pass to remind herself, yes, you're in 2A. You didn't wander in here. You were invited. The ticket was issued by an educational nonprofit that sponsored her travel to New York City, where she would receive a national award for her decades of work in public education. This flight was part of the recognition. This seat was not charity, it was acknowledgement. And yet, all it took was one tray, one dry sandwich, to remind her how invisible that acknowledgement became when filtered through someone else's assumptions. Across the aisle, another attendant leaned in toward a businessman in 1C, smiling as she adjusted his napkin. Behind Clara, a woman in 3A called out, "Miss, could I get another sparkling water?" "Lime only, absolutely." "Mrs. Colburn," the attendant replied, "right away." But no one returned to Clara. No refill, no check-in, not even a glance. She wasn't expecting fanfare, but she also wasn't expecting to be categorized, boxed, and discounted, quietly. Her tray still sat there, unopened, untouched. After 15 minutes of silence, Clara leaned down and reached into her bag. She pulled out a worn notebook, the spine creased from years of use. She didn't write a complaint, not yet. Instead, she began listing observations. 12:14 p.m., Tray arrives, not what was ordered. Statement special meals are reserved for priority guests. No apology. Seat 2B, lobster, wine, caviar, multiple refills, frequent check-ins. No eye contact was made after meal service. She paused, then added one last line stereotype not spoken, but deeply felt. She closed the notebook, slowly placed it back in her bag, and adjusted her seat, still calm, still present, but now watching. Her eyes didn't miss the subtle nods, the casual laughter exchanged between attendants and select passengers, the gatekeeping hidden under politeness, the hierarchy enforced by soft smiles and assumptions. She'd seen this before, not in the sky, but in school systems, hiring rooms, even public libraries. People talk about equality, but often they serve respect, selectively. Clara didn't press the call button. She didn't demand a replacement meal. Instead, she waited. Because some storms don't start with thunder. They start in silence. Clara Jennings grew up in a town where everyone knew your name and passed. South of Seattle, tucked between two truck routes and a dried-up lumberyard, she learned early that dignity had nothing to do with wealth. Her father, a Vietnam vet, worked nights as a mechanic. Her mother, a school nurse, clipped coupons, baked casseroles, and ensured every kid on the block got flu shots, even if their parents couldn't afford them. Clara never had the right shoes, never had a new backpack, but she always had books, always had questions. And by 16, she was already tutoring younger students from her front porch. She didn't plan to become a teacher. She became one out of necessity. One of her favorite students stopped showing up to school in junior year. His mom had lost her job, and the family couldn't afford the bus fare. Clara offered to pick him up, then a few more kids. Then she started an after-school group. 10 years later, that porch project became a mobile education van, school without walls. It started with just her and an old, repurposed shuttle bus. Now it had over 60 volunteers, multiple learning pods, partnerships with rural districts across the state, and a graduation rate that made headlines. She didn't chase recognition. In fact, she avoided it. But the stories traveled, and eventually, so did the invitations. In spring, Clara received a call from EduLed Impact, a nonprofit based in D.C. They had selected her for their Educator of the Year award, not for test scores, but for rebuilding trust between schools and broken communities. The awards ceremony would take place in Manhattan. EduLead insisted on flying her out. They booked her on flight 4810 first class. No upgrades, no nuggets. You've earned this seat. Ms. Jennings, said the coordinator on the phone, don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. She smiled, quietly. It was the first time in decades anyone had said something like that to her. But it didn't stop her from polishing her old shoes, brushing the lint off her cardigan, and double-checking her backpack 3 times before heading to the airport. Not out of insecurity, but out of habit. Clara never tried to look rich. She just tried to look not out of place. But now, sitting in 2A, she realized it didn't matter. Across the aisle, a woman with diamonds at her ears and a tiny dog in her lap asked, not quietly, she must be staff, right? Or some kind of contest winner. No one answered, but one of the attendants chuckled softly as she passed by. Clara heard it. She heard everything. She didn't need to guess what they saw when they looked at her. Someone who got lucky. Someone is out of their depth. Someone temporary. The irony. She wasn't just an award recipient. She wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't just someone on this plane. She was. In fact, part of EduLead's Strategic Equity Council, the advisory board that reviewed every institutional partnership, including Stratus Air, the airline now proudly sponsoring the gala she was flying to. She had helped approve this contract, not for perks, but because Stratus had promised a renewed vision of inclusivity in first-class service. Clara had trusted them. But now she saw the gap between policy and practice, and it sat in front of her on a plastic tray, a turkey sandwich, lukewarm water, and a quiet decision to treat her differently. She reached for her phone and typed a short message to Talia Green, EduLead's travel coordinator. Can you double-check my meal order? Something doesn't add up. No big deal, just making sure there's no system issue. Talia replied in less than 5 minutes. I looked into it. You absolutely had a GF vegetarian meal logged in, confirmed weeks ago. That was supposed to be part of Stratus's Elevate tier protocol for award recipients. I'll escalate. Clara's lips pressed into a line. She didn't reply. There was nothing else to say. She already knew. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't a mix-up. This was a judgment. She set her phone down, took out her notebook again. New page, new title. When service isn't equal, she wrote Flight 481. Row 2A. Treatment deviated from policy. Attendant verbal note. Standard meal is fine for comp seats. Surrounding passengers visibly prioritized. Consistent engagement. She paused, then wrote one more line. Bias often speaks in quiet efficiency. She looked around the cabin again. The rows, the uniforms, the practiced smiles. Everyone knew their role. Everyone knew who belonged. Except the script didn't account for her. What didn't they know? Clara wasn't just taking notes for herself. She was gathering evidence, not for revenge, but for exposure. Because she had spent her whole life watching people she loved, students, parents, neighbors, get treated like background characters in rooms they had every right to be in. But not this time. Not her. Not today. As the flight continued, Clara didn't press the call button. She didn't complain. She just watched, documented, remembered. Because she knew the system didn't fear loud voices. It feared calm, prepared ones. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft ding. Attendants began gliding up and down the aisles like performers on a stage, performing their rituals with mechanical grace. Clara sat still. Round her, passengers unfolded laptops, ordered brandy, and laughed softly. You'd think it was a private club, not a commercial flight. She reached for her notebook again. Note number 7. First-class hospitality appears highly curated, but selectively delivered. She looked up. A young attendant, mid-20s, clean-cut, hair slicked neatly to the side, passed her row. He smiled at 2B, called him by name. Another glass. Mr. Danvers. Danvers raised his glass like royalty. No one looked at Clara. She pressed the pen harder against the page. Note number 8. Systematic pattern of disengagement, intent unclear, but outcome consistent. 10 minutes later, Clara watched as the flight attendants began distributing dessert menus, one by one. White linen napkins were tucked, name cards acknowledged, and cheesecake slices elegantly plated. No one approached her. The woman behind her, in 3A, leaned forward and asked, "Excuse me, I think you skipped that row." The attendant glanced back. "We've already provided all standard amenities for that seat, ma'am." It wasn't said rudely, it was professional, but Clara knew better. She had trained dozens of teachers on how language, tone, phrasing, omission, shape perception are more than content. And this wasn't service. This was quite disqualifying. The concept was familiar professionalism as camouflage for exclusion. She'd seen it in job interviews where dialect triggered bias. She'd seen it in school evaluations, where disruptive students were disproportionately brown and poor. And now she saw it in the air, behind perfect uniforms and platinum name tags. Not rude, she murmured to herself, just calculated. She returned to her notes. Note number 10. Prejudice often hides behind protocol. She turned slightly in her seat and watched as another attendant leaned into the row across the aisle. "Would you like your espresso now, Mr. Whitmore? Or with dessert? Let's do it now and add a splash of Bailey's." "Of course, sir." Their voices were low, intimate, as if this were a private exchange between people of the same world. Then silence. No one asked Clara if she'd like anything. No one asked her name. Clara glanced down at the blank corner of her tray table. A small bottle of water still sat untouched. The sandwich had started to sweat inside its wrap. She opened her notebook again and wrote invisible. On purpose. About an hour into the flight, Clara stood to stretch. She stepped quietly toward the restroom at the front of the cabin. As she waited in line, the same flight attendant who had dismissed her earlier appeared with a tray of Petite Fours. "We're passing these out for our top-tier loyalty members," she explained to the man in 1A. He took 2. Appreciate the gesture. Then the attendant looked up and saw Clara standing there. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "You doing okay?" she asked, voice suddenly sweet. Too sweet. Clara nodded once. "Sus." "I am, boss. Let us know if you need anything," the attendant added. but her voice already had the flatness of formality. The kindness came too late, not because Clara wanted apologies, but because she could tell it wasn't kindness. It was containment. Keep her calm, keep her compliant. When Clara returned to her seat, she noticed something subtle. Her water bottle had been swapped out for a colder one. No note, no acknowledgement, just a silent substitution, as if to cover their tracks. But the moment had passed. The gesture wasn't corrective. It was reactive. She didn't touch it. 20 minutes later, a man walking down the aisle, likely returning from the business class lavatory, slowed when he reached Clara's row. He glanced at her tray, then at her face. "Excuse me, are you traveling for work?" he asked. His tone wasn't curious, it was cautious. Clara smiled politely. "Sort of." "Ah," he nodded. "Conference support," she raised an eyebrow. "What makes you ask?" He hesitated. "Oh, I noticed the badge on your bag. Thought maybe logistics or coordination team." Clara had no badge. Nothing marked her as support staff. She just didn't look like a keynote. "I'm receiving an award," she said evenly, "for national impact in education policy." The man blinked, his eyes narrowed slightly, recalculating. "Oh, wow, didn't mean anything by it." "I know," Clara replied softly. "Most people don't." He offered a stiff smile and moved on. Clara reached for her pen again. Note number 16, default assumption, subservient role. She closed the notebook and set it on her lap. That moment, that one exchange, confirmed what she'd been feeling all flight. It wasn't just inattentiveness. It was a narrative, unspoken, but present, shared by glances, assumptions, and withheld service. And she wasn't angry, she was ready. Because what did the airline know? Clara Jennings didn't carry a title, but she carried reach. She wasn't on this flight by accident, and she wasn't leaving quietly. The moment Clara's plane touched down at JFK, her fingers moved with a precision that came from years of documenting, reporting, and building systems others overlooked. She wasn't filing a complaint. She was initiating accountability. Clara sat in the back of her black car service, headed toward her hotel in Midtown, as her thumbs tapped across her phone screen. To Marissa Kwan, subject flight 4810. Incident. "Hi, Marissa. Just landed. I'd like to quietly escalate a situation, details attached, including timestamp notes. I believe it's a direct violation of the service equity clause we negotiated with Stratus. This goes beyond poor hospitality. It reflects a pattern of exclusion built into how certain guests are categorized, particularly those traveling on nonprofit-sponsored seats. Let's talk before the board meets tomorrow." Attached were photos of her meal tray, a redacted transcript of her brief conversation with the male passenger, and snapshots of her boarding confirmation with the pre-selected meal clearly marked vegetarian GF. Clara didn't need to make threats. She just told the truth. Marissa Kwan was more than just a contact. She was Director of Partnerships at EduLead Impact, the woman who had personally helped draft the clause that required all airline partners to commit to unbiased service regardless of fare origin. And she replied in 10 minutes, "I'm on it. The CEO of Stratus is already in town for the gala. He'll be in that room tomorrow. We'll raise it directly." Clara exhaled, not with relief, but with resolve, because now it was no longer just about her. It never had been. It was about all the other Claras out there, the young teachers, social workers, healthcare volunteers, who'd received generous trips from organizations trying to honor them, only to be reminded, once airborne, that they didn't quite belong in the seats they were offered. They weren't denied loudly, just overlooked efficiently, professional, polished, prejudiced. Later that evening, Clara stood before the mirror in her hotel suite. She smoothed out the creases of her navy blue dress, pinned a silver brooch to her collar, and tightened her bun. No makeup, no high heels, just presence. She looked into her reflection with that same quiet, assessing stare she had given so many young students before big interviews. "Walk in like you wrote the invitation," she whispered to herself, "because you did." The ballroom at the Midtown Renaissance was glass and gold and over-decorated. The carpet smelled like roses and old money. The crowd was a mix of tech donors, Ivy League board members, and nonprofit directors in cocktail attire. Clara didn't search for anyone. She didn't need to. When she stepped through the doors, eyes turned, not because of glamour, but because of gravitas. People knew her name. They just didn't always remember her face. Now they would. The event host, a young executive from the foundation's marketing team, waved her over, glowing. Clara, you made it. We're so honored you're here tonight. Happy to be. Clara smiled. You'll be seated with the Equity Council and the Stratus leadership team. Hope that's okay. Perfect, she said. She was already prepared. The head table was flanked by logo banners, soft-lit floral arrangements, and a modest brass plaque that read Premium Access Sponsors. Thank you, Stratus Air. Clara took her seat between Marissa and a tall man in a slate gray suit with sleek cufflinks and corporate polish written all over him. Hi, he said. Ethan Caldwell, president of customer experience at Stratus. Clara Jennings, she replied. Educator. There was a slight pause. Ethan studied her face. Something flickered behind his eyes. I believe you were on flight 4810 today. I was. Another pause. This time, Clara didn't break eye contact. We were told there was some inconsistency in your onboard experience. Ethan continued. I'd love to hear more. Then let's skip the small talk. She reached into her small handbag and pulled out a folded document, a one-page printout of her notes. Bullet-pointed, annotated, signed with her initials. This was how I was treated. This was what your system marked me as. And this is how it contradicts every value listed in your Elevate passenger promise. Ethan accepted the paper as if it were something far heavier than it looked. We appreciate your candor, he said. I'm not here for appreciation, Clara replied. I'm here for structural change. What do you suggest, for starters, she said. Stop flagging nonprofit travelers as standard tier in your internal logs. Stop assuming ticket origin reflects passenger value. Marissa chimed in, we can also re-review your training modules on discretionary service and how implicit bias shows up through soft protocol. Ethan nodded slowly. You'll have a formal response within 72 hours, he said, personally overseen by me. Good, Clara said, because I've got 3,000 teachers watching how this plays out. And then she turned toward the stage. That night, Clara didn't talk about her flight in her acceptance speech. She didn't mention trays or attendance or assumptions. She spoke about dignity, about visibility. What happens when people are praised publicly and disregarded privately? She ended with one line. We don't need to be made visible. We already are. We just need institutions to stop looking away. The room stood for her, but the real applause came later in inboxes, in Slack threads, in internal memos. By the next morning, Stratus issued a confidential service alert to senior flight crews across its major hubs. New equity protocols to review before VIP flights. Passenger origin must never alter tiered service expectations. Period. And Clara Jennings. She boarded her return flight in seat 1C, same cardigan, same backpack. But this time, every eye met hers, and every tray arrived exactly as ordered. 3 days after the gala, an internal message was circulated across all executive teams at Stratus Air. It bore the subject line Passenger Experience Escalation. Action required. The memo didn't mention Clara Jennings by name, but it didn't need to. Everyone in upper management had either heard the story or had been CC'd on the documentation. The message was clear. Recent events revealed inconsistencies between our stated values and in-flight practices. A thorough review is underway, starting with priority service criteria, implicit bias training, and how passenger origin data affects onboard experience. If respect is only offered selectively, it isn't respect, it's branding. And branding can be changed, effective immediately. Flight crews will receive retraining under our revised First Class for All directive. That last phrase, First Class for All, was bolded. It became the unofficial name of a new company-wide campaign. But for Clara, it was never about campaigns. It was about correction. She returned to Seattle the next day. Quietly. No press, no post. Her welcome at the airport came not from a limousine, but from two of her students, both now teachers themselves, who picked her up in the same nonprofit van she'd driven for over a decade. "How was the food?" one of them joked. Clara smiled better the second time. They didn't ask for details. They knew her well enough to recognize when something had happened and when she wasn't ready to talk about it. Back in her office, Clara sat by the window and opened her laptop. The sky outside was gray, and the streets were slick from overnight rain. Her inbox was full. A handful of teachers from across the country had written to her, somehow having heard what happened on that flight. Some guessed, some had a friend in the industry. Most just said the same thing. "Thank you for saying what we've all felt. I didn't know we were allowed to call it out like that. It's not about meals. It's about being made to feel lesser, even when we've earned the seat." She replied to each one, not with long explanations, just a single line: "You deserve to be seen. Don't let the silence convince you otherwise." Weeks passed, quietly. Small changes began taking shape within Stratus. Passenger satisfaction scores among sponsored travelers rose for the first time in 5 years. Several longtime flight attendants, the same ones who had considered Clara standard fare, were quietly rotated off international routes. In their place came newer hires, trained under the revised protocol, where respect wasn't a reaction to status, it was a starting point. One internal trainer described it best: "We used to serve by profile, now we serve by presence." Meanwhile, Clara returned to her usual schedule. She held story circles in underfunded districts. She reviewed grant proposal for rural Wi-Fi expansion. She sat on the school bus with two kids from a foster shelter who didn't want to go home alone. The award plaque from EduLad stayed in its box, but the lesson she taught that day, 35,000 feet above ground, was spreading farther than she imagined. One morning, about 2 months later, Clara received a package, no return address. Just a navy blue envelope and a wax seal with the initials EC. Inside was a handwritten card: "Ms. Jennings, thank you for your clarity, your composure, and your conviction. You didn't ask for consequences, but you showed us what happens when respect becomes conditional. You've helped shift a culture that is too comfortable with silent sorting. I hope we're better now, and if we're not, I know you'll tell us. Sincerely, Ethan Caldwell, EVP." Stratus Air. Beneath the card was a small metal pin, the new first class for all insignia, awarded to employees who complete the new empathy certification program. Clara placed it on her desk. She didn't need it for herself, but maybe someday she'd pass it on to a student, one who boarded their first flight and needed to know they belonged. She thought the story was done. But stories like this don't end. They echo. And one day, they land exactly where they're supposed to. 6 weeks later, on a routine flight from Phoenix to Boston, something unexpected happened. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, maybe a little lost, stepped into the first-class cabin holding a creased ticket. Her jeans were faded, her sweater oversized, and her hair pulled into a no-fuss bun. The lead flight attendant looked up, gave her a warm nod, and said, "Welcome aboard. You're in 2A, right this way." No raised eyebrows, no hesitation. When the woman reached her seat, a second attendant approached, gently asked, "We have confirmed your gluten-free vegetarian meal. Would you like tea or water with it?" The passenger blinked, surprised. Tea would be lovely." She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She was a social worker, flying to receive an award for trauma intervention in youth shelters. No one in the cabin knew that. No one asked, and no one needed to, because something had shifted. Not just in protocol, but in posture. Clara Jennings never knew about that flight. She never met that passenger. But in many ways, that seat 2A no longer belonged to her. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt small in a place they had earned. Every student who had been told, "Not your lane." Every parent who sat in the back because they didn't fit the image. Every human being who had been quietly made to feel less than. Clara hadn't just corrected a meal. She had cracked open a blind spot so large it had become standard. She had done it without rage, without shouting, without ever once saying, "Do you know who I am?" Because dignity doesn't demand recognition. It simply reminds people you're already enough. Later that year, Stratus Air published a new service charter. It included a paragraph that hadn't existed before: every passenger, regardless of fare class, origin, or appearance, is to be treated with dignity, Attention and authentic respect. We don't serve based on assumptions. We serve based on presence. That clause. It was written by Clara. At the bottom of the page, her initials. Discreet, deliberate. She didn't need her name up front. She just needed to know the next person would never be made to feel like she had. And if you're reading this or listening, maybe you've been that person. Maybe you've walked into a room where they didn't see your worth. Maybe you've sat in the right seat and been made to feel like it was a mistake. If that's you, this story is for you. Because the lesson isn't about airlines, it's about people. How do we treat strangers? How do we measure value? How we decide quietly who's worthy of our kindness? And maybe next time you see someone in a space you didn't expect them to be, instead of assuming they don't belong, ask yourself, why did I think they didn't? Thanks for watching. If this story made you pause, even for a second, then let it go further. Drop a comment if you've ever felt overlooked in a place you earned. Share this video with someone who's been quietly powerful their whole life. And hit subscribe, because we tell real stories that challenge how we treat each other. One seat at a time. Respect isn't a luxury. It's not reserved for the loudest, the richest, or the best dressed. It's what every human deserves before they say a word. Let's build a world where dignity doesn't depend on the ticket you hold. See you in the following video.